Good evening, my friends, my old friends, and new friends that I see tonight. My name is Marco Gonzalez. I am the Regional Director of Yahadi Nunum. Welcome, everybody, to this new conference of Beyond Memory Yahadi Nunum's program online. And tonight, I'm very honored and happy to have with us Esther Safran Foer, the author of If I Want You to Know, I Know, I Want You to Know We're Still Here. Um, Esther is a friend, and she's supporting, and she's part of the American Friends of the Holocaust board. So we know her from a long, long time. And Father Bois, who is the president and founder of Yahadi is with us tonight. So Father Bois, the micro is to you to introduce our dear friend Esther Foer.
Good morning, good evening. It depends where you are. So I am Father Patrick Desbois. I built with Marco Gonzalez this organization called Yahad in Num, together in Hebrew, Yahad in Num, together in Latin. And you know, together it means that you believe in meeting, you believe in relation. You believe that God makes you meet the people you need to meet to go on. And Esther Foer is one of these amazing person I had the grace and the gift, I would say, to know. She lives in Washington, D.C. But when I met her, she was in charge of a wonderful synagogue with a lot of animation. And I visited this place with the cardinals and bishops. And we became friends. And slowly by slowly, I discovered that this lady was a nice life in Washington, had one part of her art and memory in Ukraine, far away from Washington, in a small village. And we spoke and spoke and spoke. And one day, Esther did what very few people are doing. She took a flight ticket and she went back there. And it's a whole story she will share with you. It's the story of a lady with a great heart who decided to come back to her roots, to the family roots. She had also wonderful children who wrote very well-known books. Esther, it's my honor to introduce you.
Thank you. Thank you. You know, it has been my honor to know you and to follow the incredible journey that you have taken and that you have led all of us on. So yes, I'm supposed to introduce myself. You introduced me. I'm Esther Foer. I professionally spent most of my life in public affairs consulting. The last 10 years, I ran this organization, Sixth I, and a historic synagogue that was a major cultural institution in Washington. And one day I remember getting a call saying that Father Patrick Dubois had a delegation of French Catholic priests coming. Could they come to Sixth I for a visit? And I said, oh my God, I'm going away on vacation. I want to meet this man. And I made them promise that I said, yes, he could come, but I made them promise that he would bring them, that they would bring him back. And he did. And for me, that began a long and amazing journey into my own family's history and to trying to understand what has happened in Eastern Europe and Central Europe to Jews, and to also understand what's happening to other persecuted peoples around the world. You know, while my own story is focused on the Holocaust in Poland, Ukraine, right now in my house, I'm downstairs in the lower level of my house because I can't go upstairs because there are 10 Afghan refugees upstairs and we wouldn't be able to talk. They're here, they escaped Afghanistan, they escaped another horrible world crisis. And when somebody asked if someone had a place to house them temporarily for a couple of weeks until they found a place, I said, how can I say no? I'm a refugee. And I think we all, and all of us in our own way, are refugees from somewhere. And we need to understand that we're all in the same boat, in the same place. So it's truly been my honor to work with Father Dubois, to do what I can to support this incredible man, a French Catholic priest, who has done what most Jewish organizations, none could do, gone throughout Europe and gathered testimony on what happened to Jews, not in the concentration camps. That story is kind of well known, but there were over 1.5 million Jews, probably more, that were killed one by one, bullet by bullet. And their stories have not been told until Father Dubois started to tell it, started to go village to village to uncover these truths. So to you, I will be eternally grateful. So the book, my book, which is available in several languages, but here it is in English. I Want You to Know We're Still Here. It's kind of an interesting title. I fought with the idea of what the title should be. Even as I wrote it, I wasn't sure what to call it. And somewhere in the book, I write this message, I want you to know we're still here. And my editor said, that's it, that's the title. Because it is a story of tragedy, but it's also a story of gratitude. It's gratitude for the life that I've been able to live, the life that the rest of my family couldn't. I'm the daughter of 2 Holocaust survivors, the only survivors in large extended families in Europe. My grandmothers, my grandfathers, my great-grandparents were murdered. And I don't like to say perish because in fact, they were murdered. And they were murdered not in the concentration camps, but by bullets, by the Einsatzgruppen, who came and did this one by one. And eventually it just became too hard for the soldiers to be doing this, to face their victims one-on-one. They would have to take breaks. You can read all about it on the Yachad in Unum website and in Patrick's books. So briefly, my book, it's a story about my family. It's a story about the Holocaust. It's a story about memory. And it's a story about the search for truth. The book has 3 sections, and I will go through some of it. And I look forward to your questions at the end. I hope we'll have time for some questions. The first part of the book is about my parents' pre-war and wartime experiences. They were amongst the lucky few that made it out. 3 million Polish Jews were killed. 90% of the Jewish Polish population, and most of those were killed in this Holocaust by bullets, bullet by bullet. Then I want to talk a little about the post-war period. I was born in post-war Europe in a time that isn't talked about very much. You know, everybody thought the war was over and everybody, you know, just went on and lived happy lives. And it wasn't like that. Like the refugees upstairs in my house from Afghanistan, nobody wanted Jewish refugees. The war was over 6 million people were killed, and nobody wanted to save Jewish refugees. We'll talk about that a little. And then finally, in 2009, really with the guidance of Father Dubois, I was able to go back to Ukraine to use the hints that he gave me on how to uncover my family's stories, to the truths of those stories. So my story is a little unusual in that there was a book before my book. My middle son wrote a book. He went to Ukraine. He tried to take the trip that I took 11 years before I took it. He was in college. He was at the university. He didn't find anything at all. He didn't have enough clues. It was a college student's poor trip, poorly guided, poorly conceived. And he came back. And what he did was wrote a work of fiction. He was trying to reclaim his family's story. And since he didn't have the real story, he created this fictional version to fill the hole that is in his heart, that was in his life, about what happened to his ancestors. The book was called Everything Is Illuminated. It ultimately became an international bestseller. And I started to get calls from people, excuse me, people who said, you know, none of that is true. I can't believe he wrote this story about these shtetls. And I had to keep responding, of course it's not true. It's a work of fiction. It's a novel. And I was actually a little upset that people were unhappy with, you know, my wonderful son's work. Here I was celebrating his success and they were complaining about it. But it was because of his book that people started to come to me. I started to listen. They said, I know the real story. Nobody knew the whole story, but by starting to listen to people, I was able to put pieces of the story together. I was able to find out where my father really was during the war. I was able to, I guess one of the biggest clues was I was looking for information about my father and I was using his name, Louis Safran, or in Yiddish, Label Safran. Well, those are not the names people went by in these shtetls. They all had nicknames. Nobody went by a first and last name. And it wasn't until a trip to Israel when I met somebody who knew my father's nickname that I was able to unlock a lot of the story. So why do we do this? Why do I go to Ukraine to find my family's past? Why is Father Dubois going from village to village, year after year, interviewing people to find these stories? You know, you talk about 6 million Jews, 1.5 million children. Those are numbers that are just too hard to absorb. How do you deal with a number like that? It's in telling the stories. It's seeing yourself in these stories. And it's when I realized I had to become the storyteller. Oh, geez. Joshua 4, FaceTime video. Excuse me, that's one of my sons. And because he just called, I'll tell you that each of my sons played an important role in my work in uncovering this story. They like to joke, my sons, that I use child labor to do the things that I didn't have the courage to do myself. And really, for most of my life, I didn't have the courage. I wanted to put pieces of the story together. My mother wasn't prepared to tell me very much, so I sought opportunities to involve my children, because while my mother and I, when we spoke, it was about inflicting pain on each other. I was afraid to ask her questions because of everything she'd been through, everything she lost. I didn't want to make her life more painful. And she didn't want to tell me these stories because she didn't want to pass that pain on to me. But in talking to her grandsons, she saw her immortality. And she was much more willing to open up to them. So each of my sons, in a different way, played an important role in opening these stories up. And ultimately, I think they grew as individuals because they know what happened to their family. And I urge all of you who are on this call or people that I run into to tell your story. These stories will build resilience in future generations. None of us live life on a straight line. It's my grandchildren know what happened to their great-grandparents, and they know that things happen in the world, and God knows they're happening in the world today. But you understand that you can survive, that most of us can survive, that with strength and resilience you can survive. There's there's no real Hebrew word for history. The word that is used in its stead, historia, comes from English, which comes from Greek. Those of you who read the Bible know that it's full of stories. And it's in those stories that we can see ourselves. And it's been said the Jews are not a people of history, that we're a people of memory. History is about the end of something. Memory is about the beginning of something, about taking a story and passing it on. So my mother, I honestly, oh, well, let me just tell you about my sons, first of all, the bright light of the story. So my oldest son, Frank, when he was in high school, I said, oh my God, we don't know Bubby's whole story. And she won't tell me. Bubby is what they called her. It's Yiddish for grandma. And so he spent he had a school break, and he had an assignment to write something during that school break. And he spent 6 weeks with her, taking her from grocery store to grocery store to buy whatever bargain she was seeking that week from whatever coupons she had clipped out of the paper. And he did it with a tape recorder between them. And he would casually ask her questions. It wasn't an intense interview process. It was casual. It was a grandmother talking to her grandson. And from that, we got the outline of the story. And then, of course, Jonathan took this fateful trip to Ukraine and came back and wrote this work of fiction. And that unlocked a lot of information that we didn't have. And my youngest son, who was just on the phone, and you'll have to tell him why I didn't take his call, he ultimately named his 2 beautiful children for family that were victims of the Holocaust. And so each of them has played such an important role in carrying this story forward. So my mother was this powerful little woman who had such strength. And in order to survive, when 90% of Poland's population is murdered, how do you survive? And my mother would have told you with luck and intuition. As the Germans were entering her little town of Kolk, she just had an instinct that she should run. She was with 5 of her friends, her mother, her aunts, her uncles, everybody. You know, terrible things have happened to the Jews in the past and will survive. And people just didn't know what to do. But my mother's instinct was to pick up and run. And she went with 5 girls, 5 of her friends. She went back to, it was July 1941. She could tell you the exact date and the hour. And she went back to her house. Her mother looked on. They didn't speak to each other. She took a winter coat. This was July. A pair of scissors. Something told her that that's what she would bring. She expected to be back in a couple of weeks, but that's what she took. And she started meeting her friends in the town square, and then started walking. And her youngest sister ran after her and took off her shoes, her sister Pesha. And she gave my mother her shoes. And she said, you might need these. And this is where we all break up when we hear this story, because it's kind of the central story of my mother's survival. Pesha took off her shoes, walked home barefoot, and my mother quickly lost one of the shoes, and of course never saw her sister again. What did she do? She followed the retreating Russian army. And while I don't know every place that she walked along the way, I know that she ended up in Asia, in Tashkent, in Uzbekistan, some of it by foot, some of it hitching rides, surviving in any way that she could. She took the scissors that she had with her and sewed holes in her pants so she could steal potatoes and put them into her pants. The 5 girls quickly got separated. 2 were together and 3 were together. My mother was with one friend, Sura. All 5 survived. 3 of them in Israel, 1 in Canada, and my mother in the United States. When she came back, so as I was writing the book, I thought, well, you know, she went all this way. How far was it? And a lot of it on foot. And when I looked at maps, I realized it's though she had walked across the entire United States, as though she had gone from New York to California, sometimes without food. Sora, the woman she was with, said that there There was so much malnutrition that she had to help my mother dress. But they survived and they went back. As soon as they knew their village was liberated, even before the war was over, they went back. They expected to see their family. And what they saw, the first thing my mother saw was someone walking down the road in her sister's dress. She went to her house. It had been completely leveled. They spent one night there, and people in the village, a village that was half Jewish, and now was half that size. There was a man, she spent one night, people said, you can't stay. There's still anti-Semitism, you have to leave. But she was allowed to stay one night in somebody's house. And there was one man who had survived. He ultimately ended up living in Israel. And he had seen everything that had happened. And he stayed in Kolk in hiding so that he could tell the survivors who came back what happened to each member of their family. He told my mother that her oldest sister, Livsha, who was very beautiful, was murdered early in the war. And he said it was so terrible, I'm not going to tell you about it. My mother alludes to rape and so many of the other things that happened to beautiful young Jewish girls. Livsha had 2 babies. The babies stayed with my grandmother. My mother's sister, Pesha, the one with the shoes, Pesha snuck out of the ghetto with a silver spoon to try to trade it for food for her little nieces. Pesha was murdered. In the end, it was my grandmother and my great-grandmother holding these 2 babies, walking to the mass grave to be murdered in Kolk. The man who told my mother these stories, his name was Moshe Koifman. He ultimately ended up in Israel. He stayed in this town, told everybody who came back the stories. And then my mother told me he went to Israel and he never spoke again. What he had seen was too much. He wanted to survive to tell the stories, but then he couldn't speak again. I don't know a lot about my father's story. It was one of the things that I was desperate to find out, and why I ultimately, in 2009, went back to Ukraine. I went back with my oldest son, and the going back is kind of interesting because I was already a grandmother. I was fully an adult, and my greatest fear was telling my mother that I was going back to this place where the worst things that could happen to anybody happened to her family. I'd made all the arrangements. I'd hooked up with some people from the shtetl. I'd hired a researcher who'd done all of the preliminary work for me, but I still had to tell my mother. And I went to see her, and I only had about a week to go, and I just had to tell her. I couldn't just disappear for 2 weeks. And I told her I was going back to Ukraine. I was going to Kolk. I was going to Trochenbrod, which was where my father's family had come from, a town that was totally leveled, where there is nothing left. And my mother looked at me and yelled, "How can you do this to me?" And I realized years later that I was leaving her the way she had left her mother. And I said, well, it's okay. I'm taking Frank, my oldest son. She said, you're taking your child to this place? He has babies. The next day she called me, and she was a very smart woman. And she said, try to understand where my fear is coming from. And of course, my last call to her as I left on a Lufthansa flight, of all things, I ended up on a German Airlines going back to my shtetl because it was the only airline whose name I recognized that would fly into Lvov. She said her parting words were, take a good book, stay in your room, don't eat anything they give you, because my mother kept kosher. And she said, and don't do anything stupid. And with that, I flew off to Ukraine, where I had already gotten advice from Father Dubois about how to talk to people in these villages, how to make sure they don't feel that you're coming back to take back your property, how to get the stories from them. A wonderful piece of advice from Father Dubois was go and see them twice. They're going to remember things the second time. They're going to feel more comfortable talking to you the second time. And indeed, in every shtetl that I went to, I found people who knew something about my family. I was able to find the house where my great-grandfather and great-grandmother lived, where my great-grandfather was killed because the Germans were there. They'd been in their houses. They were rounding everybody up for the ghetto. And he said, "You're going to kill me anyway. I'm not going." So they just shot him in his house. My other great-grandfather was one of the first people killed. He was religious, and he was going to the synagogue in the morning. So the Nazis bolted the doors of the synagogue and set it on fire. So many stories, so many horrors. But for me, and I think for lots of other people, how to capture those stories, how to capture those memories. And of course, Father Dubois has helped us with that in the research he's doing and in the trips to all of these shtetls. And it was interesting because I read the interviews you had done in the shtetls where I came from, my family came from, and I ended up meeting some of the same people. These were the oldest people in the town that had some piece of memory that they could share. My hunt, by the way, the biggest mystery in my life at this point is, as an adult, my mother casually mentioned to me, long after my father had died, that my father had another wife and a daughter who were murdered in the Holocaust. Here I was as an adult learning this for the first time. I never imagined I would find out anything about my half-sister, but I did. That this trip I took, I met somebody who had played with her, somebody who could describe her to me, could tell me where she was murdered and where that mass grave is. And today I have a granddaughter who carries her name. The other thing I want to tell you about a little bit, and because it resonates for me as I have refugees upstairs in my house from Afghanistan, is I was a refugee. I was born in Lodz, Poland after the war. Lodz was then kind of the centerpiece of Poland, where it was the crossroads for people leaving the east, going west, trying to find survivors. My family lived there for probably a year and a half. My parents were married in Lodz. They were married in 1945 on May 1st. And why is that date important? Because it turns out it was Lag BaOmer. It's the day in between a period of mourning where Jews can have an official Jewish wedding. And I can imagine thousands and thousands of Jewish couples, some of whom had only known each other for a week, waiting to get married on that day. Whether they believed in God or didn't, or what they felt, they were waiting for a Jewish wedding on this day when it was religiously possible. We escaped across the border from Lodz. The border, literally the Iron Curtain was coming down at about the time that I was born. And if you wanted to get out of Europe, and of course there were still pogroms going on in Poland, and there are a lot of books. Jan Gross has written a wonderful book called Fear, talking about the murders that were still taking place. The war was over, but people were afraid of having Jews come back, of taking their property back, of whether anti-Semitism, for so many reasons. And we understood we had to get out of Poland if we were going to get out of Europe. So we smuggled out. My mother said she only took a few things. They didn't tell anybody they were leaving. My father went in and opened his business. He had a business in Lodz. We lived in a beautiful apartment that was fully furnished with pictures on the wall that had belonged to another Jewish family. When I look at the pictures of it now, tablecloths and everything, and I realized some other family walked out of that apartment and never came back, and we were now occupying it. My mother put a few things in some sort of a something to carry. Hopefully my clothes and a few diapers and whatever she used for diapers at that point. And my father went into his business and told people he was just going out to take a smoke. And we smuggled across the border in a false bottom truck. I was 6 months old. My mother had to stuff cloth in my mouth so that I wouldn't cry out loud in the most dangerous parts of the trip. And we made it into Germany, first to Berlin, and then to Ziegenheim, which was a displaced persons camp. And, you know, I have a lot of pictures from that point in my life, and they're pictures of a happy little toddler. But in writing this book, I had the opportunity to do a lot of research, to read books about that period in time, to read actually one book called Surviving the Americans. Indeed, we were put into these displaced persons camps, first by ethnic groups. So the Poles were together, the Lithuanians, the Estonians. And what that meant is that the Jews were sometimes being housed with the collaborators who tried to kill them. Ultimately, the army understood the Jews had to be separated. But the conditions were terrible. We moved into these camps. In our case, it was a former prisoner of war camp. There weren't proper facilities. They weren't clean. The refugees themselves had to clean up these camps and try to figure out how to live in them. The Jews, as I understand, as I have read, were given less food than the Germans. I didn't understand this. I'm sure my parents did. I knew that I was in a community where I was loved by two people who had lost everything, and I represented the future. I was part of a community of other survivors who became our extended family. But in fact, the conditions were terrible. And it wasn't until some of the chaplains arrived, particularly the US military Jewish chaplains, who understood what was happening to the Jews and, you know, wrote letters back and tried to explain to President Truman and elected officials in the United States and Jewish organizations that we've got to do something to support these people. And it was all very slow to happen. General George Patton, who oversaw these displaced persons camps in the southern part of Germany, in his diary wrote that that the Jews are subhuman. They're not civilized. He was comparing us to the Germans, who were, of course, being deferential to the army, trying to say they weren't Nazis. And the Jews were trying to figure out how to get out of Europe, how to claim their lives back, and they weren't interested in following the rules of the US Army. Ultimately, we did find a way out. We tried, and by the way, there were conferences about who would take the Jews, and the answer was no one. Actually, the Dominican Republic said they would take Jews, but that was only because they were trying to rebalance their Black population. It wasn't because they were interested in helping the Jews. President Truman sent Earl Harrison, the dean of the University of Pennsylvania Law School, to examine what was going on, to deal with these reports that he was getting about how mistreated the Jews were in these camps run by the US Army. And Harrison wrote back in a report to Congress and to President Truman and said, we're treating the Jewish refugees the same way the Germans did, except we're not murdering them. And that's how bad the conditions were. My own family wanted to go to Brazil because my mother had a large family there. My great uncle had promised that he would pay for the tickets, that they would provide housing, that we wouldn't be a burden on the Brazilian state. And of course, like the rest of the world, Brazil didn't want us. Ultimately, Congress passed what was called the 1948 Displaced Persons Act to admit refugees. They did this under pressure. As I said, nobody wanted the Jews. There was a Canadian legislator who in Parliament, when they talked about admitting Jews, he said, one is too many. Congress, the US Congress ultimately passed this DP Immigration Act, but they wrote it in a way that was blatantly anti-Semitic. They wrote it saying that you were eligible to enter the United States if you had been in Germany by December of 1945. Well, most Jewish survivors who were in the East had not made it back. Most of the survivors were Poles who had escaped, like my parents, and there was no way to make it back. And in fact, I was born in Poland after that deadline. So my father, who was apparently very good at maneuvering and wheeling and dealing, arranged for a fake birth certificate for me, saying that I was indeed born in Germany, not Poland, and that I was born after that deadline, to make it possible for them to say they had been in Germany. There was also a prerequisite in this law. They wanted 40% of the people who entered the United States to have been farmers, which worked for some of the non-Jews, but there weren't many Jewish farmers. And I have in my documents here in my office a statement from, I'm not sure who, that my father was classified as a first-class farmer. The United States Congress authorized the admission of 200,000 displaced persons. Only about 25% of that number were Jews. And that was because they didn't want us. And it has been documented that about 10,000 were Nazis. Why would they admit Nazis and not Jews? Because the geopolitical situation had changed. The US was no longer fighting Germany, it was fighting the Soviet Union, and they were admitting people that they thought would help them with intelligence about the Soviet Union. It's a period of time that isn't talked about very much, but certainly resonates for me as we look at refugees all over the world, whether it's the Afghanis that are upstairs in my house, or the people at the Mexican border, or refugees the world over who are struggling. It's a incredible reminder of where we are and what we need to do. One of the questions I often get, and I hope I will get some questions from the people here, one of the questions I often get is, why this title for the book? I want you to know we're still here. And as I said, partly because as I wrote the book, I realized it was about tragedy, but it was also about triumph, because we are indeed still here, because at least in our case, I've been able to raise a beautiful family and build a future, a Jewish future here in the United States. But the literal meaning of that title, when my son Frank and I were in Ukraine and we were visiting mass graves, before we went, I thought, I want to leave something behind. Why? I don't know. I mean, it was a mystical kind of thing. Why would I care about leaving something behind in this country, in these shtetls where my entire family had been murdered? But I had in my head that I wanted to do that. And so what I did, we do an annual New Year's card, which I am very proud of, because it includes my family, my growing family, a family of now 14. Whereas I grew up with no grandparents, no cousins, no aunts, no uncles. I now have 14 members of my family. My grandmothers, who probably thought no one survived, have descendants. So I decided to take extra copies of this card and bury them in each of the mass graves where my family is buried. So my son and I would go to each of the graves. We'd say Kaddish, the memorial prayer, and then we would take a fork that we had borrowed from the hotel and dig into the dirt of Ukraine next to these memorials, this message from our family that we are still here. 2 years after our trip was 2009, 2011, I received an email from one of the guides that I had hired. And he sent me a picture of our card kind of coming out of the dirt. And I thought, wow, it has survived 2 Ukrainian winters. And what he did is he then put it in plastic and with a rock, put it on top of these mass graves. So it was, as I say, it's a story of tragedy. It's a story of triumph. And it's a story that needs to be recorded by people like me, by the wonderful work that Father Dubois is doing. It's a story about the Jewish refugees. It's a story where there are Holocaust deniers saying this didn't happen, but it's a story that is still happening all over the world to other refugees. So with that, I'd be thrilled to take your questions.
Esther, thank you very much. Personally, when I listen to what you told us and what you shared with us tonight, I find the sense of the work that I've been doing for the last 20 years of my life. Thank you very much for sharing that with all of us.
And it's why I am so appreciative of the work that you are doing for all of us, for Jewish refugees, for other people. I remember Father Dubois once saying to me that for Jews, he deals with other refugee crises, but Jews want to know what happened to my uncle, what happened to my grandfather. And that's so important to know. It's so important for the world to know. And for me, it's important for my family to know. I've raised this family. They're living wonderful lives here in the United States. They have found success, but they need to understand where they came from, what happened to their family, and what their obligations are to the world.
Absolutely. I'm just going to let Father Dubois to make a question or remark, and then I will open the micro to everybody. If you have some questions, I think that we have like 20 minutes for 15, 20 minutes for questions, but Father Dubois, please.
So Esther, I know you since long time, and I can tell you, you are not the same person that I met. It seems like you come back from a long travel in your life. It's very moving for me because I know you since long time. I met your mom. I know your children. I know your husband. I know your wonderful home, your relations. And suddenly with that book, but also with your speech you gave to us, you open a face that rarely people share with a large. I would make 2 remarks. The first one, that is very, very remarkable and very rare. You remember as much as you can what happened to your whole family before you, with all the dramas, with all, and with no hate. And I would say, and after you remember also what happened in the IDP camps in Germany. That's very rare what you say, absolutely very rare. And also that the non-welcome you had from American authorities, it's also very rare. But people share that because it's not funny, it's sad. And I had the same experience now with Yazidi survivors that nobody wants. And I would like to ask you this question, but perhaps complicated question. Who are you today, Esther? You are not the same person. You carry a message of extreme capacity to bear the reality. with no hate, and growing a future with your children, with your relation, with your book. You are an enthusiast lady. We shared a wonderful lunch today with you in a wonderful place. You are a smiling lady. You're not part of these people who would never smile because they know the past. I think you have a special strength to bear the truth of the past, but of today, and you engage a word that is so rare. It's so rare, that either people speak about the past, they say awful things, and they turn the page and they say never again and something like that, and that's finished. But you don't say that. It's the same person who bears the truth and welcome now 10 Afghani refugees in your home. It's why you are speaking from the underground of your wonderful home. So I dare to ask, after having written this book, after engaged, how I imagine so many conversations, after made all your research that you made, after having accepted to even to know what happened to you when American didn't want you, that your father had to make false paper to a baby to make the baby welcome in America, and it's a real story. Who are you, Esther? Are you conscious that you are not the same person and that you have, with this capacity to bear the truth, because the truth is heavy, always, always. Many people dream or see harmful things, but very few people bear the truth and are acting positively. Because you don't wouldn't say, oh, it's terrible, my life. No, you act positively. So I would say, how do you identify yourself today, and what is the key message? Because you have a key message for young generation that you carry.
So that's a really profound question, because I am not the same person I was. Not the same person I was before I took that trip, and not the same person I was before I was able to write this book and to deal with the horror that my family had been through. And it's very interesting that my mother died December 18th, 2018. And of course, for those of you who are Jewish online, my daughter-in-law immediately said, leave it to Bubby to die on the 18th day of the year 2018. My mother was a very strong woman. She believed in life. And even in her death, she died on a date that symbolized life. I feel, one, that she passed that strength on to me. But I also feel that I was able to deal with a lot of things in the writing that I had kept bottled up inside of me. And you know me, you know that I always smile, that I'm fairly easygoing. But the actual process of writing and dealing with my feelings and getting them on paper, things that I hadn't talked about to anybody in my life, that was a profound experience. And I did come out of it a different person. So I mentioned the day my mother died. My book was due to my publisher February 1st, 2019. So I had a month and a half. I had the book essentially finished because she was living in our house and we knew that the end was near. She lived until she was almost 99. But in the period between the time that she died and the time I turned the book in, it was done. But I went back and I was able to say things that I wasn't able to say to her, or even in writing while she was alive in my house, things that I felt might hurt her. And it was so irrational because at that point, her mind was still good, but she was so weak. It was really important to find the truth, the kinds of truth you try to find, the kinds of truth I try to find. Is it the whole truth? I'm sure it's not. But I found enough of the truth to find peace for myself and to move on. And you're right, I had spent most of my professional life either working for corporations or working for politicians and trying to build a Jewish future. And I realized at some point I had to go back and deal with my past. And it was such an important thing for me to do. And I am today I am a different person. profoundly different, I don't know, but different. I'm able to be much more open about who I am and what matters to me. And I know you had a bunch of questions, but that's the one I can remember.
I would dare last question. When I saw the title of your book at the beginning, when you published the book, I was wondering what was this title for? And now for me, it seems like an answer you give to your dead people, you give to the present people in America, with the past of America, and you give to America today. Am I correct?
It's an important message. It has lots of different meanings, but that was the most literal meaning. We are still here, and I am proud that we're making a difference in the world today. Should we go to some of the other questions, Marco? What do you think?
Yes, the micros are open, so you just need to talk.
I have a question, if I can. I took a trip to my grandfather's village, similar to your son, Jonathan, where I didn't know that much what I was getting myself into. It was a village that was really split in the middle, half Jewish, half Ukrainian. And when I arrived there, like Trachtenbrad, it was completely obliterated.
Mm-hmm.
Everything was gone. The thing that shocked me was the level of violence and activities of the Ukrainians themselves. When I came home, I contacted Martin D. from the Holocaust Museum. It was an absolutely outstanding researcher, and he provided these KGB records from the 70s where they interviewed people, a gold mine. And it was 200 Ukrainians and 2 Germans descended on this village, murdered them all in 2 days. And that was happening all throughout rural Ukraine. And it's an area that I'm so glad Father Dubois is looking into. And I wanted to get your thoughts on the intense level of hatred and violence by these Ukrainians. I don't know if it's a question for you or Dr. Dubois, but I was stupefied that it was so violent.
It's probably a question for Father Dubois, but it's exactly because of that my mother's like, how can you go back to this place? She was sure something awful would happen to me. And when I went to Ukraine, as I said, I had met with Father Dubois, I don't know if it was the summer before, that summer in Paris. And he told me that this part of Western Ukraine, which used to be Eastern Poland, is the most anti-Semitic part. If you go further east in Ukraine, towards the Soviet Union, it's not as anti-Semitic. This is the heart of it. My mother was terrified. She saw, she lived in a shtetl where she went to school with Ukrainian kids and Polish kids. And for me, when I went, I was a little nervous. And the first night but of course I was paying people to be my guides. So they were going to be nice. And the first night at dinner, with a group of Ukrainians, I just put it on the table. I said, people tell me that I should be scared, that there's so much anti-Semitism here. And they say, no, they denied it. I did meet people in Kolk, for example, where they were taking me around to see all of the oldest people. And I met people who said, oh, no, I wasn't there then. I don't know what happened. But Father Dubois is better able to talk to this in a broader context.
It's a complicated question, but when I began in Ukraine, I began my research in Ukraine. First, we decided to block our point of view because we wanted to know the truth. So when we interview people, we don't show what we think, and sometimes they don't even know if we are pro-Jew or anti-Jew. And we interviewed the killers, we interviewed also saviors. And I began, and we worked a long time in Ukraine. And you are right, you begin to think, bad Ukrainian. But after I worked in Poland, and I felt exactly the same thing. And I will never forget when I made a mistake, and the guy opened the door, he said, who are you? And said, and say, I'm looking for people. Oh, my father was there. And the father told me, oh, I saw Jews who escaped. I could find them and give them back to the Germans, so they killed them. And he showed me a small mass grave that he did. And so after you say bad Ukrainian, after you say bad Lithuanian, after you say bad Letonian, and after you say bad Russian, because it's exactly the same. And now I work in Iraq about the Yazidi and the Christian with ISIS, and there is no Polish and no Lithuanian and no Ukrainian. It is exactly the same. When you make a genocide, you cannot make a genocide without the neighbors. You open a box of Pandora. You authorize the neighbors to be part of the crime, and the neighbors are completely changed in every country. And now I think, unfortunately, it's not an Ukrainian question, it's not a Polish question, it's not an Iraqi question, a Syrian question, it's a human question. And it's very dangerous when you make a genocide, because finally you focalize every hate and transform people in killers, and Hitler never missed workers. In Romania, it's the same. In Moldavia, it's the same. I interviewed a man, he shot 223 Jews himself. He was military, he was very proud. And so for me, it's a human question we have to treat, because today people have the temptation to join these groups, hate groups, and white hate groups, Islamist hate groups, etc., etc. And they can be easily joined by a genocide activist or a killer activist. We saw that, we see that. Right. So for me, it's a question of education today, because I would dream it would be mostly Ukrainian, but if I give an example, I don't see any difference in Romania. They killed 500,000 Jews without one German.
You know, in writing this book, I went back to my mother's papers, and I found a letter from her uncle in Brazil after we couldn't get into Brazil. And we finally ended up in the United States. His last letter to her, and I'm just reading a little excerpt. He said, I am very, very happy that you have found a place to end your wandering. But he said, there is also anti-Semitism in the beautiful land of America. He wrote this in 1950.
It's even more pronounced then.
And another question, I think that Oscar, you wanted to ask something.
Well, I really want to make a comment. One, I think the title of your book is right on. I think it's a wonderful, wonderful title. And secondly, I made a trip to the town that both my parents are from. They luckily immigrated to the United States in the 30s, so just before I was born, so they didn't have to live through that horror. I went back to the town to see if I could find anyone who knew anything about the Jews who lived there. It was a very Jewish town. The non-Jews mostly lived in the surrounding area. It's called Otinya. And what
There's outside?
Oscar?
Yes.
Okay. We couldn't hear you for a minute.
Okay. Yeah, it was called Otinya. And what impressed me also is that we went to, so no one there knew anything, or at least they claimed they didn't know anything. We went to a town that's called, it was called Stanislaus by my parents. It's in eastern Ukraine. And it's now called by a Ukrainian name. And what gave me great joy was seeing that there was a Lubavitcher Rebbe, a Chabad rabbi, who had gathered around them. And I spent about a number of young Jewish men. I spent about an hour with them. And as I was leaving, he was going to have a Bible class, a Torah class with these young men. So despite the attempt to destroy us, there was a revival of Jewish life there. And as we now know, some of the politicians are in the Ukraine are in fact Jewish. Zelensky in particular, I guess. So we live and we have remained alive in Europe despite the anti-Semitism. But your book, I can't wait to read it. Thank you.
Thank you, Oscar. We're gonna take a very last question or remark. Been an hour exactly that we have been online. If someone has something to add.
Hi, Esther.
Pepperly, my goodness.
Yes,
Somebody I went to elementary school with.
right. I'm a childhood friend of Esther's, and her family moved into our neighborhood in Southeast Washington when we were all very small children. And I had never thought about this until this moment, but I was wondering what that was like for you, you know, landing in this neighborhood that had Jewish people and non-Jewish people and kind of, you know, ordinary American life happening.
You know, I was a toddler and I was eager to fit in, and classic with immigrants, I fit in long before my parents did. I went to school, I played with you. When I came here, I had two great aunts. I mean, it's very interesting. I came to a family, my mother's family in the United States had no other descendants. I mean, it was like we came here. One of them said, it's like we came here to save them. And my great aunts all said, what do you want? You know, what can we? And I said, I wanted a doll that opened and closed her eyes. And I said it in Yiddish. And of course, I got a bunch of dolls. I was, you know, you're a child and you're loved. And you go forward. And, you know, I quickly went to school, learned English. I'm told with a New York accent, because I probably played with somebody who had New York accent. But children adjust quickly. It's that other generation. It's my parents' generation. It's other refugees. You know, in the same way that life was harsh after the war in Germany, when you came to the United States, and there are sociologists who've done studies on this. There were psychologists, sociologists who were assigned to helping these Jewish immigrants, but the message was pretty simple. Find a job, find a place to live, and get over it. You know, you have to move on. It was also the 50s. So it wasn't a time of deep introspection. So if these people who had lived through horrors had to live with their own post-traumatic stress syndrome. There was no understanding of what they had gone through, of the kind of help that they needed. It was just like, move on, you know, okay, everybody was killed. And also the wonderful American Jewish community, you know, we were kind of an embarrassment to them. Jews had come to the United States and they'd assimilated and they'd made it. And now there are these people with accents who needed help. And there was also a suspicion about who survived. How did you manage to survive and everybody else got killed? You know, there was, it's very interesting. Because of the book, I've met lots of relatives I never knew. And I recently had a reunion with a bunch of cousins. They were my mother's second cousins. In my generation, were third cousins. And they had this big family dinner, and cousins flew in from all over the country to meet because they read about my book, because my kids are doing well. And they said, how come we didn't know you growing up? And I said, well, you were the rich, fancy relatives. We were the immigrants. And that was the fact of the matter. But as a kid, it was easy to adjust. And fortunately, you and your friends welcomed me.
Thank you. We're going to have a question of Shaylee, and then we'll finish our program with that last question coming from Shaylee.
Unmute. Okay. It's not so much a question. Oops. I want to just turn this as a statement. When you're saying that, how did you, how was it handled? I grew up in Montreal, in Canada, And I was born in the 50s, so I was entering Jewish school, a parochial day school, and in the 60s. And we had, of course, I didn't know, we had most of our Hebrew Jewish teachers were from from Europe, but we didn't know. And we had a teacher, a rabbi. I was in grade 5, 6, so I'm 11, 12 years old, and we didn't treat them really nicely. And he rolled up his arm and he goes like this: "You see this? You see this? You think you can make me crazier than they did?" And we all went, he doesn't know his phone number. He has to, no clue about this. Friends, like you said, if we went to their homes, they had parents that spoke funny, didn't know anything, and then there were some whose parents were crazy, as far, would yell over it, but no clue whatsoever what had happened, where they had come from. And here, as I said, Canada. And I just want to correct one thing you said about the Canadian. None is too many.
Okay, I'm
Not
sorry.
one, not even one. None
is too many.
Yeah, so it's just a comment. The education, nobody talked about it,
Right.
unfortunately. Thank you for writing that book. And most importantly, as Father Dubois knows, thank you, because one of my good friends is a survivor, and I remember always saying, she was one of the first survivors he ever met. Am I correct in saying that, Patrick?
I'm correct. You are correct. She wanted to speak. She came to Detroit to speak, and it was completely amazing. And I went to visit you in Calgary.
Yeah, he's done amazing things. This friend that I have, her niece is on right now as well in California, I can see. And she grew up she came from Koretz. And what she always said was, they played, she was 13 or 14 years old when this happened. She was in the Ukraine, and the houses were attached. And one of the stories she tells is she grew up with the neighbors, in and out, best friends with the little girl, whatever. And the first night that her when things were going on, not the first night, but the day that her mother was taken, and her brother was already gone, and her father was already gone, and she came running home, and she ran into the neighbor's house to tell her, "Oh my God, Auntie, I can't believe this happened." And this woman, who she called Auntie, just looked at her and said, "It's because of you goddamn Jews that we're get out." And here was 12, 13, 14 years she had lived neighbors, and this woman just turned her out. So, I mean, it's unbelievable, as you say, Father Dubois, what people, it's not countries, it's the people that turn. And it's kind of because if they don't turn on you, somebody might turn on them.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much, Shelley. Thank you, Father Dubois, friends, and thank you very much, Esther, to share this time with us. And I hope to see you all next time, connected to our next conference. And Esther, once again, thank you very much for this very touching and powerful 1 hour that we spent with you. Thank you very much to all. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.